Picture this, an entire alien civilization slowly dying while the galaxy just ignored them. The Kithra were these amazing crystal-building aliens whose whole world was basically one giant musical instrument. Their cities literally sang, folks. But their sun was dying, and they'd been begging for help for 300 years. 300 years. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these beings were like. Imagine walking through a city where every building hummed with perfect harmony. The Kithra didn't use hammers or welding tools like we do. Instead, they grew their structures using specific sound frequencies. They'd stand in groups around construction site, and their voices would literally shape crystal formations into towering spires and graceful bridges. It was like watching a choir conduct architecture into existence. Their bodies were something else entirely. Picture beings that look almost like living glass sculptures, with translucent skin that caught and reflected light in the most beautiful ways. When they spoke, their words created visible ripples in the air around them. And when they sang together, which they did constantly, the whole city would pulse with gentle, colorful light. Their children learned to walk by following the rhythm of the city's heartbeat, which was actually a combined sound of millions of crystal structures resonating together. But here's where the story gets heartbreaking. Their son, which they called the Great Voice, started getting quieter. Not quieter in the way we'd think about sound, but quieter in terms of energy output. You see, the Kithra's entire civilization depended on solar radiation to power their crystal technology. As their star began its slow death, the Crystal City started losing their song, one building at a time. At first, it was just the outer districts that went silent. The Kithra thought they could adapt, maybe concentrate their population in the areas where the crystals still sang strongly. But as decades turned into centuries, even their greatest crystal cathedrals began to crack and fall silent. The population that once numbered in the billions was forced to crowd into smaller and smaller areas where their technology still functioned. Think about that for a moment. Imagine if your entire way of life, your technology, your culture, everything that made you who you are, started failing piece by piece. That's exactly what happened to the Kithra. Their crystal libraries, where they stored their knowledge in harmonic patterns, began to fade. Their medical centers, which healed through therapeutic frequencies, stopped working. Even their food production, which relied on sound-based agriculture, started failing. So they did what any desperate civilization would do. They called for help. But here's where it gets really sad. The Kithra's distress signals were works of art. They didn't just send out basic, help us messages. No, these beings poured their entire cultural heritage into every transmission. Each signal contained their history, their poetry, their scientific discoveries, and their dreams for the future. They were basically saying, if you can't save us, at least remember us. But to every other species in the galaxy, these beautiful, complex messages just sounded like random noise. The universal translators that most civilizations use couldn't make sense of the Kithra's harmonic language. It would be like trying to understand a symphony by reading the sheet music as if it were a grocery list. The meaning was completely lost. For 3 centuries, the Kithra kept sending these messages. They tried different frequencies, different patterns, different approaches. They even attempted to learn other species' languages and send more conventional signals. But by then, their population had dropped so dramatically that they barely had the resources to maintain their basic survival, let alone master alien communication systems. The worst part was watching their society slowly unravel. The great crystal orchestras that once performed citywide concerts fell apart as musicians died and weren't replaced. The floating gardens that hovered above their cities, using sound waves, crashed to the ground. The beautiful light shows that once painted their night sky with colors we don't even have names for became dimmer and dimmer until only a few faint glimmers remained. By the time their population had dropped to just thousands, the Kithra were living in a single city, the last place on their entire planet where the crystal technology still worked. They were the final singers in a world that was rapidly falling silent, and their voices were growing weaker every day. Their 300-year cry for help was becoming a goodbye song, and not a single civilization in the galaxy seemed to care enough to listen. Now, the Galactic Council, They reviewed the Kithra situation 17 times. 17, and every single time they came to the same conclusion. Too expensive, too weird, not worth it. Let me tell you how this whole mess unfolded, because it's honestly mind-boggling when you think about it. The Galactic Council was supposed to be this grand alliance of advanced civilizations, right? Picture the United Nations, but for space. They had these massive conference halls where representatives from hundreds of different species would gather to discuss galaxy-wide issues. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? But here's the thing about bureaucracy. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with City Hall or an intergalactic government. The result is often the same. Endless meetings that go nowhere. The first time the Kithra case came up, it was actually treated seriously. The council assigned a committee to study the situation. They spent months analyzing the data, running cost projections, and evaluating different rescue scenarios. The lead investigator was this fish-like species called the Aquarians, who were known for their logical approach to problem solving. They put together a comprehensive report that basically said, yes, we can save them, but it's going to be expensive and complicated. That's where things started falling apart. See, rescuing the Kithra wasn't just about loading them onto spaceships and dropping them off somewhere else. These beings needed very specific environmental conditions to survive. They required planets with certain crystal formations, specific atmospheric compositions, and most importantly, areas where sound could travel in ways that supported their technology. It wasn't like relocating refugees to existing settlements. They needed completely customized habitats. The Zephyrians, who controlled most of the galaxy's shipping routes, took one look at the requirements and laughed. Literally laughed during the council session. Their representative stood up and said, these acoustic primitives want us to terraform entire worlds just for sound? We have real emergencies to deal with. Real emergencies. That's what they called it when the Kithra situation didn't affect their trade profits. The military coalition was even worse. Their representative, a war-obsessed species called the Iron Claws, dismissed the Kithra as strategically useless. They argued that any resources spent on the rescue could be better used strengthening defenses against actual threats. To them, saving a dying civilization was a waste of military assets. But you know what really gets me? The species that claimed to be the good guys were just as bad, maybe worse. The Benevolent Systems Alliance had built their entire reputation on helping lesser civilizations. They had fancy slogans about lifting up the downtrodden and no species left behind. Their marketing materials were full of heartwarming stories about successful rescue missions. Yet, when it came to the Kithra, they quietly calculated that the public relations benefits wouldn't outweigh the costs. One of their internal memos, which was leaked years later, actually said, the Kithra situation lacks the visual appeal necessary for effective fundraising campaigns. They were basically saying the Kithra weren't photogenic enough to save. Think about that for a second. These beings were facing extinction, and one of the galaxy's premier humanitarian organizations was worried about their Instagram potential. The Trade Federation's response was the most brutally honest, and somehow that made it even more depressing. They flat out stated that the Kithra had nothing to offer in return for rescue efforts. No valuable resources on their planet, no useful technology that other species could exploit, no strategic advantages. In their official statement, they said, charity is admirable, but business is business. Every single time the case came up for review, it was the same story. Different committees, different investigators, different excuses, but always the same conclusion. The costs were too high, the logistics too complex, the benefits too minimal. The Kithra were literally priced out of salvation. The most infuriating part was how these decisions were presented. Council representatives would give these long, emotional speeches about how much they cared about the Kithra. They'd express deep regret about the situation, offer thoughts and prayers, and promise to keep looking for alternative solutions. But when it came time to vote on actual rescue missions, somehow there was never enough support. By the 15th review, the whole thing had become a joke. Council sessions about the Kithra were scheduled during lunch breaks or late-night slots when most representatives weren't even present. The case files got thinner each time, with less research and shorter deliberations. It was clear that everyone was just going through the motions, waiting for the problem to solve itself, which, in their minds, it eventually would. After all, if the Kithra went extinct, there wouldn't be a Kithra problem anymore, would there? The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had essentially decided that an entire species wasn't worth the paperwork. Enter Captain Tom Mitchell of the human ship Deep Listener. His crew was just doing routine exploration when they picked up something everyone else had missed. Dr. Lisa Park, their language specialist, spent weeks figuring out what these meaningless noises actually were. Turns out, pure poetry mixed with desperate pleas for help. Now, let me tell you about Tom Mitchell. This guy wasn't your typical space captain. He'd started out as a musician back on Earth before joining the space program. Yeah, you heard that right. A musician turned starship captain. He used to play in a jazz band in New Orleans, and he always said that music taught him how to really listen. Not just hear, but actually listen to what wasn't being said. That's probably why his ship was called the Deep Listener. Most exploration vessels had names like Star Crusher or Galaxy Defender, but Tom wanted something different. He convinced the Space Authority that exploration wasn't about conquering or defending. It was about understanding. And understanding starts with listening. The Deep Listener wasn't even supposed to be in that sector. They were originally heading to investigate some unusual asteroid formations about 30 light years away. But Tom had this habit of following interesting signals, even when they weren't on the mission schedule. His crew used to joke that he collected strange noises like other people collected stamps. On that particular Tuesday, and yes, they still use Earth days in space because some habits die hard, the ship's communications officer, Jake Rodriguez, picked up these weird acoustic patterns. Most ships would have logged them as background interference and moved on, but Tom heard something different. He described it later as like catching a melody in the wind that you can't quite make out, but you know it's beautiful. So he made the decision that changed everything. Instead of continuing to their planned destination, he ordered the ship to follow the signal to its source. Half the crew thought he was crazy. They were already behind schedule, and chasing mystery signals wasn't exactly standard protocol. But Dr. Lisa Park was fascinated. Lisa had joined the crew specifically because of Tom's reputation for finding unusual things. She'd spent years studying alien languages, but most of her work involved the same old trade languages and diplomatic communications. This was something entirely new. The first week was frustrating as hell. Lisa would sit in the linguistics lab for hours, running the signals through every translation program they had. Nothing worked. The patterns were too complex, too layered. It was like trying to read a book where every page was written in a different language, but somehow all the pages were meant to be read at the same time. Lisa later admitted she almost gave up several times. She'd been staring at acoustic waveforms for so long that she was starting to see them in her sleep. But something kept nagging at her. The patterns weren't random. There was definitely intelligence behind them, and more than that, there was emotion. The breakthrough came during her third week of work. She'd been focusing on trying to decode the signals as language, but that morning she tried something different. Instead of looking for words, she started looking for musical structures. Remember, this was a crew led by a former jazz musician, so thinking about communication in musical terms wasn't that weird. And that's when everything clicked. The Kithra weren't just sending distress signals. They were sending entire compositions. Each transmission was like a symphony that contained multiple layers of meaning. There was a literal message asking for help, but woven throughout were historical accounts, cultural stories, scientific discoveries, and even what could only be described as love songs dedicated to their dying world. The moment Lisa cracked the first complete translation was something the crew never forgot. She called Tom to the lab at 2 a.m, her voice shaking with excitement, and something else. Something that sounded like she'd been crying. When Tom arrived, Lisa played the translated message through the lab speakers. The computer had converted the harmonic patterns into words, but somehow it still maintained the musical quality of the original. What came through was heartbreaking. A mother singing to her child about the old days when their cities sparkled with light, mixed with technical specifications for their crystal-growing technology, mixed with a desperate plea for someone, anyone, to remember their civilization. Tom said later that hearing that message was like discovering that someone had been writing the most beautiful poetry in the world, but writing it in a language nobody bothered to learn. The bridge crew gathered around the speakers in complete silence as Lisa played message after message. Each one was a masterpiece of communication. Part distress call, part cultural archive, part love letter to a universe that seemed to have forgotten them. By the end of that night, it was clear that the deep listener had stumbled onto something incredible. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. This was about saving an entire way of seeing the universe that was about to disappear forever. And for the first time in 300 years, the Kithra had found someone who was truly listening. The human response was incredible. Admiral Kate Thompson didn't just send rescue ships. She sent ships specifically modified with acoustic chambers so the Kithra could travel safely. President Mike Rodriguez declared their rescue a top priority, saying it was about who we are as human beings. But here's the really amazing part. While other species saw problems, humans saw solutions. They didn't just offer the Kithra refugee status somewhere random. They found them a whole new planet and started terraforming it with crystal formations before the rescue ships even arrived. They basically said, "We're not just saving you. We're giving you a home where you can be yourselves." Now, let me tell you how this all went down, because the speed of the human response was absolutely mind-blowing. Within 48 hours of Lisa Park's translation breakthrough, Captain Tom Mitchell's report was sitting on the desk of every major Earth government leader. And I mean every single one. The President, the European Federation Council, the African Union, the Asian Commonwealth. Everyone got the same message at the same time. But here's what made the human response different from everything the Galactic Council had done. There were no committees, no months of debate, no cost-benefit analyses. President Mike Rodriguez called an emergency session, and within 6 hours, the decision was made. Humanity was going to save the Kithra, period. Admiral Kate Thompson later said that meeting was unlike anything she'd ever experienced in her 30-year military career. Usually, these high-level discussions would drag on for days, with politicians arguing over budgets and logistics. But this time, everyone just seemed to get it immediately. The president opened the meeting by playing one of the translated Kithra messages, and by the time it finished, there wasn't a single person in that room who wanted to debate whether they should help. The real magic happened in the days that followed. While other species had seen the Kithra's unique needs as insurmountable problems, humans saw them as interesting engineering challenges. Dr. Patricia Chun, humanity's leading expert on acoustic engineering, was pulled off her vacation in Hawaii and flown straight to the shipyards. Her team had less than 2 weeks to figure out how to modify transport vessels to accommodate beings who literally needed sound to survive. Think about that challenge for a second. How do you create a living environment for creatures whose entire physiology is based on harmonic frequencies? It would be like trying to design a spaceship for beings made of music. But Patricia's team didn't see it as impossible. They saw it as the coolest project they'd ever worked on. They started by studying every piece of data Tom Mitchell's crew had collected about Kithra biology and technology. Then they did something that no other species had thought to do. They asked the Kithra themselves for help. Using Lisa Park's translation protocols, they established direct communication with the survivors on Resonance Prime. What followed was probably the most unique collaboration in galactic history. Human engineers working with crystal-singing aliens to design the perfect travel environment. The Kithra explained how their bodies process different sound frequencies, and the humans figured out how to recreate those conditions inside a spaceship. The result was something nobody had ever seen before. Transport vessels that were basically flying concert halls. Each ship was equipped with resonance chambers that could generate the exact acoustic conditions the Kithra needed. But it wasn't just about keeping them alive during the journey. The humans wanted the Kithra to be comfortable, even happy. Meanwhile, on the other side of human space, an even more ambitious project was underway. Dr. James Morrison, a terraforming specialist, was leading a team that was literally growing a new world for Kithra. They'd found a planet called Kepler 442c that had the right atmospheric conditions and mineral composition to support crystal growth. But here's where it gets really incredible. Instead of just dumping the Kithra on this new world and hoping for the best, The humans spent months seeding the planet with the exact types of crystal formations the Kithra would need to rebuild their civilization. They used sonic cultivation techniques, basically playing the right sounds to encourage crystal growth in specific patterns. By the time the rescue fleet was ready to launch, New Resonance, that's what they named the planet, already had the beginnings of crystal cities growing on its surface. The humans had essentially created a world that would sing to welcome the Kithra home. The most amazing part was that none of this was done for profit or strategic advantage. There were no trade agreements, no military alliances, no demands for repayment. The humans just decided that saving an entire civilization was the right thing to do, and they made it happen. When Admiral Thompson's rescue fleet finally reached Resonance Prime, they didn't find the grateful but broken refugees that other species might have expected. They found partners. The Kithra had used the months of preparation to compile everything they wanted to share with their rescuers: their art, their science, their music, their dreams for the future. The rescue mission became something else entirely. The beginning of the most beautiful friendship the galaxy had ever seen. 6 months later, New Resonance was alive with crystal spires and harmonic frequencies. The Kithra weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And get this, their acoustic technology ended up revolutionizing human medical equipment and communications. Talk about a win-win situation. The Galactic Council was so embarrassed that they quietly changed their refugee policies. Other species started questioning their own attitudes about difficult rescues. But the best part? In their new crystal cities, the Kithra composed entirely new songs of gratitude and friendship with a species that cared when caring wasn't convenient. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't conquer or profit. Sometimes it's just deciding to listen when everyone else has stopped caring. Let me paint you a picture of what New Resonance looked like after those first 6 months, because it was honestly breathtaking. Imagine walking through a city where every building was a work of art that also happened to be alive with music. The Kithra had taken the crystal seeds that human terraformers had planted and grown them into structures that defied everything we thought we knew about architecture. The first thing visitors noticed was the sound. Not noise sound. Every crystal formation hummed with a different frequency, and together they created this incredible symphony that you could feel in your bones. Dr. Patricia Chun, the acoustic engineer who'd helped design their transport ships, visited 3 months after settlement and said it was like walking through a living orchestra where every instrument was perfectly tuned. But here's what really blew everyone's minds. The Kithra hadn't just recreated their old civilization. They'd improved it. Working with human engineers, they developed new crystal-growing techniques that made their cities more efficient and beautiful than anything they built on their original homeworld. It was like they'd taken the best of both worlds and created something entirely new. The partnership between humans and Kithra became legendary throughout the galaxy. Within 6 months, Kithra acoustic technology was being used in human hospitals across dozens of star systems. Their harmonic healing techniques could repair cellular damage in ways that traditional medicine couldn't touch. Cancer treatments that used to take months now took weeks. Broken bones healed in days instead of weeks. It was revolutionary. But the real breakthrough came in communications technology. The Kithra taught humans how to encode information in harmonic patterns, which meant we could send messages across vast distances with incredible accuracy. What used to take hours to transmit could now be sent in minutes. And the best part? The Kithra just gave this technology away. They didn't ask for payment or licensing fees. They saw it as a gift to the species that had saved them. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of humanity's actions were being felt throughout the galaxy. The story of the Kithra rescue spread like wildfire, and suddenly every civilization that had ignored their pleas for help looked pretty bad in comparison. The Zephyrians, who had called them acoustic primitives, quietly tried to establish trade relations with New Resonance. The Ironclaw's military alliance suddenly discovered strategic value in acoustic technology and came knocking with alliance proposals. The Galactic Council was in full damage control mode. Within a year of the Kithra settlement, they completely overhauled their refugee assistance protocols. They established new committees dedicated specifically to unique civilization preservation and increased their emergency rescue funding by 300%. Of course, they tried to take credit for these changes. claiming they'd been planning reforms all along. But the other species weren't buying it. Younger civilizations, especially those that had been marginalized by the galactic power structure, started looking to humanity as an example of how things should be done. The phrase, "what would humans do?" became a common question in diplomatic circles when discussing humanitarian crises. The most beautiful part of the whole story, though, was what happened in the crystal cities of new residents every evening. The Kithra had always been a musical people, but their new compositions were something special. Every sunset, the entire settlement would participate in what they called a Song of Two Worlds. It started with traditional Kithra melodies about their lost homeworld, but then evolved into new harmonies that celebrated their friendship with humanity. These weren't just pretty concerts. The songs contained actual historical information about the rescue, detailed accounts of human kindness, and promises to never forget the species that had listened when no one else would. Dr. Lisa Park, who'd cracked their language code, said these evening songs were essentially living history books that would be passed down for generations. Tom Mitchell, the captain who'd first stopped to listen, visited new residents a year after the rescue. He said walking through those crystal cities and hearing those songs was like seeing proof that the universe could be a good place if people just decided to make it one. The Kithra rescue became more than just a successful humanitarian mission. It became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in an uncaring universe is simply decide to care. It showed that when someone is drowning, you don't calculate the cost of the life preserver. You just throw it. And sometimes when you save someone else, you end up saving a little bit of yourself too.